The wind moved across the Montana plains like a slow-breathing giant, carrying dust, cold, and the memory of things that once were. And inside the weather-beaten ranch house at the far edge of the valley, Eli Carver sat hunched over the kitchen table with a 3-month-old baby crying in the crook of his trembling arm, his wife's rocking chair still facing the window where she used to sit every dawn. Smiling at the land she said God painted just for her. But she was gone now, taken too early, too suddenly with no warning, and no mercy, leaving behind a silence so wide it echoed through every room and settled like a weight on Eli's chest. The ranch chores still needed doing. The fences needed mending, the cattle needed feeding, the bills kept piling on the counter, and the baby, little June, needed more than he could give as a man whose heart had been hollowed out by grief, whose hands shook whenever she cried, whose nights were broken by memories he didn't know how to carry alone. And as he rocked her awkwardly in his arms, trying to heat a bottle with water he'd burned twice already, he whispered apologies to a child too young to understand but old enough to feel the heaviness in the air. And that was when the knock came, firm, steady, unexpected, cutting through the house like a sudden gust, making Eli straighten with surprise, because no one came all the way out here anymore. Not since the funeral, when the neighbors drifted back to their own lives, and the church ladies stopped bringing casseroles, and the men from town stopped offering help he didn't know how to accept. He stared at the door, pulse thudding, baby fussing louder, wondering who would knock. At dusk on a day when the sky was already bruised with storm clouds, and when he finally opened it, rain blowing in around the frame, he saw her, Clara Wade, standing tall in a faded coat, her chest rising with heavy breaths after miles of walking, her hair damp from the coming storm, her expression steady but her eyes soft with something he hadn't seen in what felt like lifetime's concern, real concern, the kind that breaks through a man's walls, whether he wants it to or not. And she said in a firm but gentle voice, "Eli, I heard the baby crying from the road." And though the words were simple, they carried the weight of understanding, compassion, and a promise of help he didn't know how to ask for. The storm that had threatened the horizon finally broke at dawn, washing the ranch in sheets of cold. Rain that hammered the tin roof like 1,000 impatient fists. And inside the dim, warm kitchen of the Carver ranch house, Clara moved with a quiet purpose that Eli hadn't seen in months, her hands steady as she held baby June against her shoulder, rocking gently with a rhythm that seemed older than the ranch itself, while Eli stood at the doorway watching her with a complicated tangle of emotions he couldn't name. Because after weeks of barely managing, of stumbling through days and collapsing, into nights that felt endless, seeing someone else, someone capable, someone calm, step into the chaos of his life felt both like a blessing and a bruise, like hope creeping into a place he wasn't sure deserved it. Clara, for her part, didn't speak much as she worked, only humming softly under her breath as she warmed water, mixed formula, checked the fire, moved a chair closer to the stove so June wouldn't catch a chill, her presence filling the house with a gentleness that made the grief soaked into its walls feel a little less sharp. And when she finally turned to him, hair loose around her shoulders, cheeks flushed from the heat of the kitchen, she said, "You haven't slept," not as an accusation but as a simple truth spoken by someone who understood how loss hollowed a man out from the inside. Eli rubbed his hand across his eyes, ashamed at how easily she noticed, muttering, "Didn't have much reason to," and Clara stepped closer, her voice softening as she adjusted the blanket around June. "Well, you do now." And though the words were light, they struck something deep in him, something raw and unguarded, because she wasn't talking about chores or bills or ranch duties. She meant the baby, the life left behind, the fragile thread of purpose that grief had nearly erased. And for the first time since his wife passed, he felt the smallest, almost painful spark of something that might one day grow into hope. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, rattling the windows, and Clara cast a cautious glance toward the barn, saying they needed to check the animals before the storm worsened. But she couldn't leave June alone, and Eli didn't want to leave Clara in danger. So he hesitated until she stepped forward, laying a hand on his arm in a steadying way that sent a surprising warmth through him, telling him she'd hold the baby while he checked the livestock, reminding him that a ranch like a heart doesn't stop just because it's hurting. Someone has to keep it alive. And as he stepped out into the rain, mud splashing under his boots, he couldn't shake the thought that something had shifted the moment. Clara knocked on his door, something beyond help or kindness, something he didn't fully understand yet. But he knew one thing as he fought the storm toward the barn. For the first time in a very long while, he wasn't facing the world alone, and for reasons he couldn't explain. That thought made the morning feel a little less dark. The storm passed by morning, leaving the ranch wrapped in a silver mist that clung to the fences and feels like a quiet warning that the world wasn't done testing Eli Carver just yet. And when he stepped back into the house after checking the cattle, soaked to the bone, exhausted, and chilled straight through his grief-worn spirit, he found Clara still in the kitchen, holding June close to her chest, as if the child had always belonged there. Her voice low and warm as she murmured little stories to keep the baby calm, and for a long moment Eli just stood in the doorway watching them, feeling something unexpected twist inside him, a mix of longing, fear, gratitude, and the painful awareness that he'd been drifting for months without a single anchor. And now suddenly here was someone who steadied the room just by breathing. Clara looked up, noticing the mud dripping from his boots, the slump in his shoulders, and she immediately reached for a towel as if she'd lived in the house for years. Instead of hours, telling him to sit before he froze solid, her tone firm but threaded with the same quiet kindness that had carried him through the night. And when he did sit, more from surrender than obedience, he felt June's small fingers reach toward him, grasping at the air between them, and something inside him cracked open, sharp and soft all at once. Clara saw it happen, saw the rawness in his eyes, and without making a scene, she set June in his arms, steadying them both with a hand on his shoulder as she said, "She needs her father strong." But the way she said it wasn't pressure, it was belief. Belief in a man who had forgotten how to believe in himself. They ate a simple breakfast afterward, the kind that felt more like family than he had expected, the quiet between them full but not heavy, until suddenly Clara's expression shifted as she glanced at the window, her brow tightening the way a person tightens before delivering difficult news. And she told him that rumors were spreading in town, rumors about him struggling, about the ranch failing, about whether he'd be forced to sell. And Eli's jaw clenched, because he knew that towns like theirs loved whispers more than truth, and he hated the idea of anyone pitying him or worse, judging him for the weight he carried alone. But Clara wasn't finished. She stepped closer, eyes steady, voice low in the stillness of the room, and told him another piece of news. Someone else had asked about the ranch, someone from outside the valley, someone who didn't just want to gossip but wanted to buy the land outright, someone who had visited the general store asking whether Eli was in any condition to keep running things. And the moment the words hit him, Eli felt a surge of anger and protectiveness rise so fiercely it startled even him, because this ranch wasn't just dirt and fences, it was the last piece of his wife. The last place her laughter lived, the only home June would ever know. Clara saw the storm gather inside him and laid a hand gently on his arm, grounding him, telling him he didn't have to face any of this alone. Not anymore, not as long as she was there. And as he looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since the grief swallowed his world, he realized something that scared him and steadied him at the same time. Clara hadn't just walked in to help with the baby. She had walked in like someone ready to fight for them. And in a valley full of storms, that might have been the first real miracle he'd seen in a long, long while. The sun rose reluctantly the next morning, as if unsure whether the valley was ready for another day, its pale light stretching across the damp fields and catching the edges of the barn roof where raindrops still clung like tiny glass beads. And inside the house, Eli stood with a heaviness in his chest that had very little to do with exhaustion and everything to do with the news. Clara had shared the day before the idea of losing the ranch gnawing at him like a slow-burning fire. Clara, already awake, moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing a small breakfast, her presence steady in a way that made the storm inside him feel less wild. And when she noticed him lingering in the doorway, she gave him that soft, patient look that made words feel unnecessary. But he spoke anyway, voice low and rough, telling her he had no intention of letting anyone steal the land his wife had loved so fiercely, even if he had to fight with every broken piece of himself to keep it. Clara nodded, not in doubt but in agreement, and she told him she had grown up around men who talked big but did little, and he was not one of them. Because he didn't boast, he just carried on, step by painful step, even when it felt impossible. And that was the kind of strength no outsider could measure, let alone buy out. June babbled from her cradle, breaking the moment, and Clara lifted the child with a tenderness that made Eli's breath catch, as if he were watching a piece of his life slowly knit itself back together without him fully understanding how. But before he could dwell on it, Clara told him something else. She had overheard the man in town giving a date, a day he planned to ride out and make an offer, and the certainty in her voice sent a new resolve through Eli's spine. He couldn't crumble now, not with his daughter's future on the line and not with Clara standing beside him like a shield he never thought he deserved. So he took his coat, kissed June's forehead gently, and told Clara they were going to face this challenge properly, with preparation, with strength, and with a clear message that the Carver Ranch was not up for negotiation. Clara stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm in a steadying way that made the kitchen feel warmer, brighter, more alive, and she said, "Whatever happens, Eli, you won't face it alone." And though the fear remained, the uncertainty lingered. Something inside him felt steadier than it had in months, a small but growing belief that maybe, just maybe, losing everything wasn't his destiny after all. Not as long as he had people willing to stand with him when the world tried to push him down,